and advocates from across the political spectrum to speak in their own voice, to develop an argument on the nightly news. What an indictment it is of today's abridged reporting that we can consider the days of 41-second sound bites the golden era of rational political discussion. Naturally, nothing of any significance is going to be said in 9.8 seconds, but the only importance of this to many politicians seems to be a positive one. He or she is not required thereby to say anything of significance. Issues can be avoided rather than confronted. Furthermore, the politicians have long since learned that in the days of television, pictures are more important than words anyway. Image is everything. So, along with providing the soundbite, a major imperative of the campaign is to provide each day the so-called photo opportunity, the photo bite, if you will, that will show the candidate in the most favorable light and has a good chance, of course, of getting on the evening news. It seems to be impossible for television to beat the politician at this game. Leslie Stahl did a CBS report in 1984 meant to show that the Reagan campaign's skillful use of visuals, sound, and photo bites was a cynical manipulation of television. She used numerous examples from previous television coverage. The White House loved the piece. As they told Leslie, the replay of pictures of Reagan at his best far outweighed her critical words. Besides the evening news broadcasts, the other important points of interface between the campaigns and television today, of course, are the debates and the commercial spot announcements. Both are approached by the politicians with cynicism, which results, I submit, in increasingly serious damage to their credibility with the public. Debates are to be avoided if possible. If not, they're to be minimized. Substance is to be avoided if possible. Image is to be maximized. The debates are a part of the unconscionable fraud that our political campaigns have become, and it's a wonder that the networks continue to cooperate in their presentation. There has grown up a belief on the part of the sponsoring groups and the networks that it's worth any compromise with the candidates in order to get them on the air together at all. Well, this is highly questionable. As long as we accept this as a fact, there is little likelihood that we ever will get meaningful debate, and that television will be used as it should be used to inform and educate our citizenry. Here is the means to present to the American people a rational exposition of the major issues that face the nation and the alternate approaches to their solution. Yet the candidates participate only with the guarantee of a format that defies meaningful discourse. They should be charged with sabotaging the electoral process. The network's part in this is to acquiesce in these phony debates. It's difficult, of course, for a single network to remain aloof for fear of appearing callous to its public service responsibility. On the other hand, if the networks refuse to carry these joint appearance panel shows, they almost certainly would force a highly publicized examination of the whole question of the candidate's use of television. The result, well, could be irresistible public insistence that the candidates meet in meaningful debate. The networks may have considerably more clout in this regard than they have shown any willingness so far to use. Twin evil to the debates are the 20 or 30-second or 1-minute commercials. They are misused to sell the candidate with slogans, but even worse, to permit others to scurrily, I shouldn't have written a word like that into my text, to attack the opponent while relieving the candidate of that very dangerous responsibility. All of this, the photo opportunity, the manipulation of the soundbite, the control of the so-called debates, the barrage of expensive commercials, all of this comprises the turning of political campaigns into political theater to be played out on television's home screens. The producers, directors, and stage managers of the spectacle are the candidates' managers, their handlers, their political consultants. Many have become so prominent and so arrogant that without shame they've moved on stage themselves. They become television personalities in their own right, and they appear frequently to brag of their contributions, even to claiming authorship of some of the candidates' best ad libs. They can twist a fact with such speed and dexterity that they've come to be known as spin doctors. Now, can a potential voter really take a campaign seriously after being escorted by television backstage to be shown how the managers transform and manipulate their candidates into actors? Television news competition being what it is today, its editors are unable to ignore such theater, however. So they do the next best thing. In the interest of journalistic integrity, they make sure that the audience knows that they know that they're being used. They've been fairly good at this. Frequently during the '88 campaign, the reporters following the candidates pointed out the carefully arranged management of the events, the advance teams, the recruitment and preparation of spontaneous crowds, the care and feeding of the candidate. All these were shown us, not once but several times. Mention was made openly of photo opportunities and sound bites. It was a noble effort, but it was flawed. In order to be effective critics of this political theater, the television reporters frequently had to replay the offensive material, thus giving it more exposure and probably greater attention than it deserved. Like Bush's Willie Horton ad, the defamatory commercials got so many free replays on the news programs as to become almost a cliche in themselves. Candidates found early on that to respond to a negative commercial or statement was only to invite its being repeated on the evening news. Dr. Adato's research found that networks showed 125 excerpts from candidates' commercial spots in '88. Interestingly, there were no such excerpts shown in '68. An already skeptical public might gather from all of this that nothing succeeds in our increasingly immoral world like excess, and in politics like dissembling. The politicians' attempts to control television have led to some unfortunate confrontations. In the Wisconsin primary of 1960, the viability of a Catholic presidential candidate was still being tested. We persuaded John Kennedy to appear on our election night broadcast from Milwaukee, and in the course of the interview, I naturally asked his opinion of how the Catholic and non-Catholic vote was going. He obviously was agitated, and only later did I learn that his campaign manager, Brother Bobby, claimed that he produced Jack for our broadcast under a promise that the Catholic issue would not be raised. I was never informed of such a promise, if indeed one was made by our producers. But John Kennedy soon thereafter called on CBS President Frank Stanton to complain about our coverage with a warning whose implication was unmistakable. He noted, I've been told, that if elected president, he would be naming the members of the Federal Communications Commission, to which CBS was in many ways beholden. Dr. Stanton courageously stood up to that threat, as he did on so many other occasions in defending television's free press rights. Apparently, the Senator then Kennedy cooled down in his opinion of CBS a little bit later, because he did agree to go on a television program which I had devised, which is kind of interesting to contemplate today. At that time, issues were so much discussed that personality of the candidates was hardly brought up at all. And I conceived of a broadcast, which today sounds ridiculous, but it was new at the time, that we would do a broadcast getting the candidates on and talk about nothing except questions that would expose their personality, if you please. Strange today to think of that, isn't it? Well, Kennedy turned me down at first, but Nixon accepted, and therefore Kennedy was forced to come in. Nixon even volunteered to go first, which obviously was was not the preferred position, since the man who went second was going to get some idea of how the broadcast went. My first question to Nixon, incidentally, was, Mr. Vice President, you're a skilled politician. You must know that there are a lot of people who say they don't know what it is, but they just don't like you. What is it you think they don't like about you? Unfortunately, he answered it like he was reading off of a teleprompter. Well, it's number one, number two, number three. And the whole broadcast went like that. It killed the whole idea of spontaneity. At any rate, the following week, we were doing Senator Kennedy from his home in Georgetown, and we did the whole thing. We finished it, and he got up and with a very perfunctory goodbye went upstairs. I went out to the truck out in front to take a look at the tape before we replayed it shortly thereafter. And our producer came running out of the Kennedy house, all a dither, saying, the senator says we have to do the program over. It has to be done over. He didn't like it. He felt that we had placed him in a position on his couch that wasn't favorable to him. He wants to do it over. And I said, well you got to have you explained to him that, we said it was unrehearsed and so forth on the Nixon broadcast. We're going to have a disclaimer that he's asked to do it over, and he's not going to like that. I explained all that to him, but he says he wants it that way. So I went upstairs to his bedroom, which incidentally, I'm sure you all be proud to know, had a big Harvard banner on the wall. He was lying on one twin bed, shoes off, jacket off, tie undone. And I walked in. He said, "You ready to go?" And I said, "No, I'm ready to argue some more." And he said, "Well, no, my mind's made up. I want to do this." And I pointed out again, look, we're going to have these disclaimers. The public's not going to, they're going to feel that it's unfair, that you're taking unfair. I said, I don't care about that. That's the way I want it done. And so I said in frustration, well, all right, Senator, but I think that's the lousiest bit of sportsmanship I have ever seen in my life. And turned on my heel and to walk out. I got to the door and he called me back and said, "Wait a minute, go ahead and use it." The sportsmanship thing got to him. The pressure that politicians, excuse me, including government officials, put on the media is most likely to be effective at the reporter level, where personal friendships or the threat of losing a valuable source for a future, more important story may be persuasive. Of cases where political pressure reached the highest level, that is, between high officials and network officers, in my 2 decades as anchor of the CBS Evening News, I know of only one instance where the pressure worked at all, and that was when Charles Colson, representing President Nixon, complained to CBS President William S. Paley about our evening news 2-part series on the Watergate scandal. Because of astute diplomatic handling by our not always astute News President Dick Salant, the only, not always diplomatic, did I say? News President Dick Salant, that astute. This diplomatic News President Dick Salant, the only result, always astute, not always diplomatic. Let's clear this whole thing up. The only result was a slight reduction, I'm happy to say, in the time we gave the second of the 2 broadcasts. This is an extraordinary record, I think, in a medium that is licensed by government. It suggests a successful separation of television and state, at least in a formal sense. That line is crossed, however, in the informal relationship between the press and its sources. To an extent much greater than ever before, the press has become part of the Washington establishment. This probably is at least partially a result of the improved economic status of news people, which in our society of distorted values makes them more socially acceptable. Reporters today are better educated and far better paid than ever before. The inherent danger, of course, is in reporters and editors getting so close to their sources that they are more inclined to protect them than to expose them. This growth of mutual trust also probably has contributed to the increasing use of the anonymous informed source, a practice which should strain the public's faith in the credibility of the press. The economic improvement in the lot of the press generally has had another insidious effect, perhaps affecting its political reporting. There was a day not far distant, just before World War II, when nearly all of us news people, although perhaps white-collar by profession, earned blue-collar salaries. We were part of the common people. We suffered the same budgetary restraints, the same bureaucratic indignities, waited in the same lines, suffered the same bad service. We could identify with the average man because we were him. That perhaps still exists on some levels of journalism and in some communities. But certainly in Washington and the major cities where the press most intimately interfaces with politics, the press today is elitist. This has come even as daily journalism has become more responsible in the restricted sense that it has become more unbiased, more impartial, more informed, more factual, and more accurate. Newspapers and television are a far cry from the days up to World War I, when editors practiced personal journalism and proudly shaped their news columns to reflect their own views. Perhaps this remove of the journalists from a deep, passionate, personal concern with the problems of the majority and the simultaneous disappearance of a daily dialogue between competing newspapers arguing the issues of the day together have contributed substantially to the apathy which has afflicted our electorate. Among the Fourth Estate elite, there are none more economic elite than the television anchor people. Their, should I say our, highly publicized salaries have elevated them, that is us, in the public's mind, and perhaps occasionally in our own minds. They do have tremendous power. Never in the history of journalism have single voices reached so many people on a daily basis. By their presence at an event, they accentuate, perhaps even on occasion, distort its importance. Their power, however, is not unlimited. They are restrained by a series of checks and balances which even our founding fathers could not have conceived. An anchor's attempt to skew the news in order to peddle a particular point of view would run against, first, the ethics of the program's writers and producers, and if their questions weren't break enough, then the news department's front office, and finally the network executives. Their power most frequently cited is that of selecting each day the agenda of items for public consideration. But even that power is circumscribed by the fact that no one anchor is a monopoly, and the agenda will be set by consensus of all television and the press. Despite the know-nothing accusations of Spiro Agnew and his ideological confederates, there is no agenda-setting conspiracy among them. What confuses the public, and sometimes the politicians, is that the press inadvertently sets the agenda simply by the way it defines news. As long as most journalists in print or broadcasting believe that news is that which affects the most people, either intellectually or emotionally, in their minds, their pocketbooks, or their hearts, they are going to play the same stories about the same way. A problem with the exalted position in which the anchor is perceived by the public is not his direct influence on the daily news report, but the tendency for him or her to slide from observer to player. Sometimes this is the unintended result of a purely journalistic exercise. We at CBS News are still cited, erroneously I believe, for deliberately dabbling in diplomacy with our broadcast that brought Egypt's President Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Begin together. But their meeting was a purely serendipitous outcome of a broadcast that started out on a far different tack. I had the first television interview with Anwar Sadat soon after he succeeded Nasser as Egyptian president, when it was still quite uncertain that he would be able to hold on to that post. We sat under a huge banyan tree out at the presidential residence on the banks of the Nile, and he droned on and on and on. It was perhaps the dullest interview I'd ever suffered through, until that moment when he brought me wide awake by saying, "And I shall go to Jerusalem." My gosh, I had a scoop. Under questioning, however, it turned out that he was using the phrase as a figure of speech to indicate that there would be peace in his time, that even he would be able eventually to travel there. Well, thereafter he repeated that statement many, many times around the world, various occasions, and always it started a little furor of rumor, quickly to be put down upon questioning. Turned out the reference was always equally vague. He made the statement one Wednesday afternoon to his parliament, and a group of Canadian parliamentarians were there. They heard this statement, "I shall go to Jerusalem," and then they dashed right off with that ringing in their ears, no explanation, as they went on to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem itself. And they saw Begin, and they asked him, he said he'd come to Jerusalem. Begin said, "Well, if he said he'd come, let him come," that kind of thing. And that started some more rumors, of course, around everywhere. It went on all weekend, these rumors, Saturday and Sunday, and nobody seemed to get to either of the principals and get this thing settled, particularly to Sadat. So on Monday morning, we put in a satellite call to Sadat, got him on the satellite, and I knew he was going to knock down the story. I was going to ask him what are his conditions to go to Jerusalem. He was going to say when there's peace, and that would settle it. The whole thing would be taken care of at that point. I got him on the air, and I said to Mr. Sadat, "Yes, Walter. How's Barbara?" I didn't want to talk about how Barbara was. I want to talk about something else. But he said, "Yes, Walter. Yes, Walter." And I said, you said that your parliament that you would go to Jerusalem. "Yes, Walter, I shall go to Jerusalem." I said, "What are your conditions for going to Jerusalem?" "Well, the Israelis have to withdraw from the Golan Heights. They have to withdraw from the Sinai. They have to return Jerusalem to there." I said, "No, those are your conditions for peace. And those are your conditions before you go to Jerusalem." "Oh, no, 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 Walter. Those are my conditions for peace. I have no conditions for going to Jerusalem." I was, of course, again awakened by Mr. Sadat's statement, and I tried to pin it down, and I said, well, you have no condition." "No, I have no conditions." "Well, when could you go?" "Anytime, anytime." I said, "Could you go this week?" "Yes, I could go this week." Well, with a sharp news operation, of course, already, Bud Benjamin, our beautiful late producer, was on the phone to Tel Aviv. "Get Begin, get Begin. Cronkite's got to talk to Begin on satellite." We got Begin a couple of hours later, and I repeated this conversation, the start of it. He said he would come. And he said, "Well, that's fine. Tell him to come." I said, "Well, he said he needed something more than that. He needs an official invitation." "Tell him he's got an official invitation." I said, "No, I think you've got to tell him he's got an official invitation." And he said, "All right, tell him I'm sending an official invitation." And I said, "Now, he said he can come this week." Begin looked like I had hit him in the solar plexus. He said that? He said he can come this week? He said, "I've got to go to London." "Never mind, tell him to come." Friday he was there, and history, I think, is still in the making on that one. This clearly was not a case of a newsman helping a source float a trial balloon. However, television journalism in this case at least speeded up the process, brought it into the open, removed a lot of possibly obstructionist middlemen, and made it difficult for the principals, of course, to renege on their very public agreement. Foreign correspondents frequently and eagerly floated trial balloons in the old days of slow communication by cable and slower production of newspapers. Days went by between the filing of the first cable dispatch until it was answered by all affected parties, and armies could be marching or governments fall in that time. Today, this neat connivance between press and politics is almost passé. Instant communications by satellite shoot down the trial balloon before it rises above the corn rows. In the early stages of the Iraq crisis, a rumor floated around Washington that Baghdad was talking up some possible points for negotiations. That evening, Dan Rather, in his noteworthy interview, asked Saddam Hussein about that, and Hussein said there was absolutely nothing to it. That same afternoon, Ben Scowcroft reacted similarly at the White House. TV brought a quick end to what possibly was a trial balloon floated by some interested party. Anchor people have acquired a great prominence, and there's no danger in that as long as they themselves are level-headed enough to understand their limitations. The present ones are admirable in that regard. Two situations appalled me when I sat in the anchor chair. For one thing, there were those who would come up to me on the street and say, "Oh, I believe everything you say." I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and shake them and say, don't. We have hits, runs, and errors, just like baseball teams. And I wanted to convince them of that. It seemed so hard. Equally appalling were the number of persons who urged me to run for public office, for everything from mayor to president. Dog catcher was never mentioned. Some were delegations from established political organizations. Others were amateurs who merely approached by mail, such as the students at Vassar who said they'd put a down payment on a storefront to run me as the draft for president. They said they'd like to know what my intentions were before they added up the rest of the down payment. I wrote them back that I could go Sherman one step further If elected, I'd be impeached. The overtures from the professional politicians taught me, if I needed any more lessons, how cynical our political process really is. They always approached me with flattery about my fame and the respect in which people held me, and then went on to the fact that I was so well known that the campaign would be an inexpensive one. But not once, mind you, did any one of them, and there were quite a lot, not once did they ever ask me where I stood on the issues. Not once. It's possible that they mistook my impartiality on the air as approval of their side. People have a tendency to do that. If you don't say anything against them, they assume you're for them. I fear, however, that these professionals figured that once in office they could manipulate this amateur and that it didn't really matter what my own views were. I've stood on a long-held principle in refusing even to entertain the idea of running for office, besides all the obvious reasons why I shouldn't run. But should one who has achieved national fame as a presumably impartial news person ever run, the public's going to have every reason to question whether that person had been tailoring the news to build a political platform. And every other person who fills an anchor role is going to have to live forevermore under that shadow. The burden of credibility already is heavy enough without having to assume that extra load. I tried to explain that to Bobby Kennedy once in 1968, 68, I guess. I had just returned from Vietnam and the controversial broadcast in which I stepped out of my normal role and clearly identifying, I hope, the material as editorial opinion that suggested that we should seek an honorable peace and get out. Well, Kennedy called me down to the Senate office to have lunch, just the two of us. He said he wanted to hear more about Vietnam. Turned out, I think, he had a couple of other things on his mind. The world didn't know at that moment that he was considering whether to run for the Democratic nomination against, it was assumed, the incumbent President Johnson. After hearing his strong views on Vietnam, which happened to coincide with my own, I fell into a dangerous trap, which always lies there for the unwary newsman who succumbs to the heady narcotic of being in on the inside. I became a player rather than an observer. If you feel so strongly on the subject, I said to him, it seems to me you certainly ought to run for the presidency. He said, give me 3 reasons why I should run, and I'll give you 3 reasons why I shouldn't. Well, we discussed Vietnam a little longer, and then he changed the subject. He said, you don't vote in New York, do you? And I said, yes, I vote in New York. He said, well, you aren't registered as a Democrat then. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm registered by belief and conviction as an independent. And he said, well, that doesn't matter. I want you to run for the Senate in New York next time. And I thought I rose to a wonderful moment. I said, you give me 3 reasons why I should, and I'll give you 3 reasons why I shouldn't. But I went back to our Washington Bureau and found that Roger Mudd had prepared a piece, a very good piece that evening, on the fact that the Kennedy clan and advisors were all gathering at Hickory Hill. They were going to discuss whether or not Bobby should run or not. And much of the material he had was some of the things that Bobby had told me in our very much off-the-record luncheon. Well, I had to get back to him and tell him that Roger had developed this thing on his own, that I hadn't fed him these facts, and try to explain to him as best I could the circumstances, a difficult situation, which is one of the reasons why you shouldn't go off the record, a newsman, ever. But at any rate, I called. Frank Mankiewicz, his assistant, said that he was on the floor, couldn't be disturbed at the moment, but he'd take a message to him. And I told him to tell him the problem, and also that would he give me a comment on the possibility of his deciding to run that weekend. And Mankiewicz came back. I think he was a little miffed because he wasn't in on the lunch, and he said, I don't know what this is about, but I have a message here for you from the senator, and he says you can use it only if you use it in full. And here is the message. I am thinking of running for the presidency, even as Walter Cronkite is thinking of running for the Senate in New York. A few days later, I was to learn again the dangers of a newsman trifling even ever so innocently in the complicated game of politics. Dr. Stanton, president of CBS, called me to his office and sternly faced me down with a serious complaint from President Johnson that I was urging Kennedy to run against him. So much for our off-the-record luncheon. I've learned also the peril of fame and the danger of one's most off-the-cuff remarks being repeated and usually distorted. It makes one guard his tongue, as in this incident, following a speech to the Foreign Policy Club, I think it was called, at Notre Dame. I was being driven back to the train station, that's how long ago it was, by the sponsor of the club. I shall call him Father O'Brien. We were getting along famously when he asked, "Do you know our Senator Capehart?" And I allowed as how I did. He asked, "What do you think of him?" I said, "Well, I'm an impartial newsman, you know, and I don't render personal opinions of that nature. But I guess you do know that Newsweek's annual poll of the Senate press gallery, he was voted the dumbest man in the Senate." "Well, that's why I asked you," said Father O'Brien. "He made this same lecture that you did last year, and I was driving into the station, catch the same train, and he said, 'What's your name again, Father?' And I said, 'Father O'Brien.' He said, 'No kidding, you wouldn't be the son of old Father O'Brien who was out here in the mathematics department for so long, would you?" Distortion by compression. Distortion by compression may be the single biggest problem with television news, and it clearly affects reporting on politics and public policy. The TV correspondent, as well as his subjects, is a victim of soundbite editing. With inadequate time to present a coherent report, he or she seeks to craft a final sentence that, in summary, might make some sense out of his or her gibberish. That's hard to do without coming to a single point of view, and a one-time editorial is born. Similarly, a story of alleged misdeeds frequently ends with a single sentence. A spokesman denied the charges. More distortion. Television frequently repeats a newspaper story that is based on informed sources. The newspaper may have carefully hedged the story with numerous qualifiers, but the time-shy newscast may not. More distortion. The broadcast and print press today must be the monitors on the character of our candidates for public office. The days are gone when the political bosses who knew the potential candidates well screened them for drinking, gambling, womanizing, plagiarizing, or patronizing psychiatrists. With the candidates going directly to the people through the primaries, it's now up to the press to serve the public interest by doing the nasty but necessary job of screening through revelation. These stories demand full explanation and a complete exposition of extenuating circumstances, but television news seldom has time for that. The highly professional and dedicated people of network news are not to be faulted for the serious limitations of their medium, nor should we today put too much responsibility for the coverage of our political campaigns on the networks. The days when they were forced to carry that responsibility alone, and generally did a good job of it, are over. While most of the public still gets most of its news from the networks, the percentage is dropping precipitously, and the networks no longer are a monopoly in this area. Responsibility now must be shared by those who share the public's attention, the independent stations and the cable outlets. CNN and C-SPAN already are helping fill the gap. They are showing the way to tomorrow's fuller coverage of our world of politics and government. Still, I'd like to see the network news departments show a little more responsibility by dropping the contrived photo opportunities and the planted sound bites in favor of longer interviews with and statements by the politicians dealing with the issues, for heaven's sakes. They could restore, at least for the campaign, regular analyses by their political correspondents, again on the issues, not the mechanics of the campaign. The network news people are, for the most part, responsible, and I have a feeling that with all the public attention and the criticism which they themselves have on occasion led, they're searching even now for the breakthrough campaign coverage that's going to dazzle their opposition and bring plaudits from an anxious public. The networks also should augment the inadequate daily news coverage with at least 1 hour weekly, at least, to examine in greater detail the campaign issues. As for the debates, I'd like to see the network simply say no to any more sham panel shows and offer their time and plenty of it for genuine debate. They surely would have the support of a fed-up public that is beginning to see how criminal taking the issues to the people it is for our candidates and their parties to avoid taking the issues to the people by the one medium that can reach us all. As for the commercials, there are constitutional questions of free speech involved, but I should like to see the broadcasting industry and the political parties work toward an elimination of negative advertising. A legally questionable suggestion is to sell nothing less than 2 minutes for commercials and permit only the candidates to appear thereon. He or she presumably would have to say something in that time, and they also would have to make any charges against the opposition face to face, as it were. The solution may well be where it usually is, in public opinion. In this election year, an increasing number of newspapers carried columns that matched facts against the claims candidates made in their commercials. Perhaps Dr. Adato or another Shorenstein-Barone scholar will provide us with a survey of how effective that has been. And we can hope that television news might join in that effort in '92. Campaign financing also must be relieved of the heavy burden of television time purchasing. The millions that must be raised to run today are dangerously corrupting our government. The electorate has the right to ask what it is that makes those elected jobs so valuable. One solution might be to ban all commercial television time and force the candidates onto public television and cable's public access channels. Reform, of course, is not the sole responsibility. Thank you. Reform, of course, is not the sole responsibility of television. The electoral process itself demands attention. Some responsibilities taken from the party organizations by the 1972 and subsequent reforms need to be restored, and the primary system needs to be regularized so the process is fair, understandable, and equally meaningful across the country. The parties can being as impartial as we can, as informed as we can, as educated as we can, we are passing on that information to the public and to the degree we should. To assume also the responsibility for educating the public, I think, is too burdensome for the media.
Okay. Question here on the left, please.
Thank you. Mr. Cronkite, I'd like to know if you think that with nationally syndicated columnists like Meg Greenfield wondering what's wrong with patriotic journalism and things like the press ban in Grenada and the press pool in Panama, do you think the press today is getting rather jingoistic or not?
Getting rather jingoistic?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that those things are causing the press to become jingoistic. I think there is a natural kind of a jingoism in all of us, in a sense, an immediate reaction to an offense, particularly by somebody like Hussein in the circumstances of that. There's a sort of an immediate reaction. We all kind of climbed on that for about 24, 48 hours till we began to think it over for another moment or two, which I suggest should have been the duty of the administration to think it over first. But no, as a matter of fact, Grenada, Panama, the pool arrangement has caused the press to be anything but jingoistic. The press is more adamant than ever in claiming its rights for free operation, free press, without pooling, without that kind of control. I'm concerned that we're not hearing enough about the limitations on the press in Saudi Arabia. There are considerable limitations today. The press is not able to go out on its own, to talk to the soldiers on its own. Everybody who goes out into the desert to where the troops are has to be accompanied by a public relations officer. The public relations officer stands by while the questions are being asked to the soldiers. That's not free reporting. That's not what we're entitled to. But I'm concerned that the press isn't screaming out loud about that. It seems to me that the press ought to be standing up on its hind legs and yelling loudly at this. The thing about the press, it's always been a little bit self-conscious about standing up for its own rights. It's strange when it'll attack anybody or anything that it feels is wrong, except for standing up for its own rights. And in that, it backs off of freedom of the press stories. You'll find them buried in the paper someday, someplace. For heaven's sakes, I'd take a banner line in the paper and say we're not getting the truth out of Saudi Arabia. If that's so, I'm not saying we're not getting the truth. I'm saying there are limitations which make me doubt that we're getting the truth. I haven't been there, so I can't report anything other than that. But don't think that the press is jingoistic because of controls from the Pentagon. Just the opposite.
We have time for about 3 more questions, and I think we'll go with the balcony once again.
Mr. Cronkite, you've spoken about the rise of cable networks. There are also satellites, when you covered a great deal of space, now broadcasting or about to broadcast television to all of Europe. And there is the imminent emergence of a digital global information environment with the instantaneous transmission of information and replication, copying, and access to information in many forms, almost anywhere. From your vantage point, where do you see the impact of these information environments going on our decisions as individuals, as on broadcast networks, and on political institutions?
30 seconds.
I gave a lecture on that in London just a week ago. took me about 40 minutes. Let's put one more thing into that mix, fiber optics. This country is going to be wired with fiber optics very soon, the next few years. Fiber optic cables is smaller than your telephone cable that are going to be able to carry literally hundreds and hundreds of channels into your house. With all of this proliferation of various channels of information, I fear very greatly what is going to happen to information flow, because I see as we get specialized channels which are going to give us very specialized news. They're just not sports scores on one channel, but only football scores, only football on one channel, basketball on another, and all that stuff. Sewing, whatever the interests of people are going to be channel by channel. And people today, happily, who are interested only in the comics or the sports scores, at least have to turn through a few pages of their newspaper and be exposed, if only momentarily, to a headline or a picture that may capture their attention. They have to listen through a news broadcast for the sports broadcast. They can always tell it if they're 3 blocks away because the sports announcer shouts quite a lot. But at least they've got the sport. They've listened to something else first. With these specialized channels, they may never be exposed to any other information at all. And we'll really have a strange kind of couch potato society. I'm very fearful of that. That's why we got to get a handle on this now, begin to teach people, for heaven's sakes, to be intelligently inquisitive so that they'll read some newspapers and magazines and books.
Okay. Question here, please.
One thing that you didn't talk about in your presentation tonight, Mr. Cronkite, is that the fundamental shift that's taken place in the nature of TV news regarding the human interest emphasis. We're now seeing more stories that focus on emotion and drama and storytelling. And I wonder if you think that change from, let's say, 1968 to 1990 has been, in the large part, positive or negative?
No, I think it's been very definitely negative. I think it's it's very unfortunate. We've got 23 minutes, for heaven's sakes. There's not time to play with those stories. There's still people, most of the people are getting most of their news from television today. A high percentage of those, a majority of those people are getting all of their news from television. Our responsibility is at least to give them a guide to their day, their day. Give them a headline guide. We can't go into very much depth, but we certainly can tell them what's happening in their world, I hope. And I don't think we should be diverting our interest to these non-news stories.
Last question. Right there?
Mr. Conkright, sir, I remember a very wonderful interview you had with General Eisenhower, walking on the beach with him. One of your last questions you put to him was you said he had been a person who for so many decades had participated in and even shaped history. And you wondered at that moment what regrets he had, what he saw in the future and as he thought about himself that made him wish that he were once again back in the driver's seat. Would it be fair, sir, to put that same question to you tonight?
Well, I certainly won't be as eloquent as General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower was on that occasion. If you remember, he talked about the boys who laid out there in the fields in Normandy as the helicopter pulled away in a beautiful shot. No, I can't be anything like that eloquent. I really can say that there are a lot of things I would have done differently, item by item, down through the years. But I would not have traded my profession of journalism for anything else in the world. I was lucky enough to be on the frontier, cutting edge of television news. That's pure happenstance, and I was fortunate enough to be there. There are many decisions that should have gone perhaps the other way. I have regrets on several stories, the way I handled them, the way I performed on them, but not in the choice of the business. I still think that journalism is the highest of callings. It's the most independent way to live that I know. You really don't have any masters to whom you must answer in television or in journalism. We are not beholden to any man or any cause or any purpose. We are as free as the birds in that regard. May not be able to work for the same employer at all the time, but we can write, and there still is that privilege available to us. And I am so thankful of that. Thank you.
I just want to say to Walter that he has started this Theodore H. White lecture series in great style, and we're in his debt. Thank you very much indeed.